Chapter 2, Stonehenge Phase I. Looking at the most important prehistoric site in Britain, Stonehenge, we are asked by archaeologists to consider that it is an astronomical calendar showing the rising and setting of the sun, moon, etc. This assumption may be partially correct, but why would you place the site in an area where trees would obscure your view? If you wish to study the sunrise and sunset with any great accuracy, would you not locate your site at the highest point available? Rather than at the top of the hill just 500 meters away that is 30 meters higher, especially considering that the builders took the trouble to get stones from 200 miles away in Wales, for what possible reason would they stop short of obtaining the best setting? As there is no observational advantage to placing the site in this location, we must therefore conclude that it was access to the area that was of paramount importance. If we look at a standard Ordnance Survey map of Stonehenge, it outlines the landscape and topology of the surrounding area by showing the contours of the hillsides. But it does not give you a clear idea of how Stonehenge sits in the landscape. For that, we need to look at a profile of the area. Amazingly, these profiles of Stonehenge show that it was built on the shoreline of a vast river complex. We can see this evidence on any elevation map, where we find that Stonehenge is sited halfway up a dry river valley known as Stonehenge Bottom. Our hypothesis and case study on the River Avon indicates that the groundwater tables during the Mesolithic and Neolithic periods were as high as River Terrace T9, which was 100 meters high. This would mean that the River Avon would have filled the dry river valley with groundwater 30 meters above the existing groundwater table. When this happens, the profile changes dramatically. And so suddenly, the impossible becomes possible, the implausible becomes credible, and myth becomes fact, for these profiles can only indicate one conclusion: Stonehenge was built on the side of a hill surrounded by water. These amazing features are not just found on a single side of the monument, we can go around the whole circle to see these watery features. I believe these profiles tell the entire story of Stonehenge. A picture is said to paint 1,000 words. These pictures show that our most famous ancient monument was once a magnificent feature in the landscape on the edge of a peninsula, surrounded by water. Now that we have shown that water existed at the Stonehenge site during Mesolithic and Neolithic times, we can resequence the events and building phases. The Ditch Moat. If groundwater was contemporary in the past, then some evidence should still be present. Consequently, one of the more interesting facts found when studying any prehistoric site is that the constructors seem to spend a disproportionate amount of time digging ditches to surround their monuments, whether around henges or barrows. This practice would be considered strange, even if the prehistoric builders had practical and modern, labor-saving tools. However, our ancestors only had the benefit of stone, bones and antler, making such excavation exceptionally slow, cumbersome and therefore even more bewildering. Looking at Avebury, a henge monument, as an example, the most conservative archaeological estimation suggests that the ditches surrounding Avebury would have taken 1.5 million working hours to build. That's equivalent to 100 people working 12 hours a day, every day, for 3.5 years. In comparison, building a wooden palisade using the same tools would have taken less than 1 month, merely 2% of the time and exhaustion. Current archaeological theories surrounding these ditches maintain that they were used either as defensive fortification or as a landscape feature to keep out, or in, animals, and even more recently bizarre interpretations, such as a ceremonial feature, to ward off evil spirits. All this shows is the levels of desperation the archaeologists have descended into in recent years in an abortive attempt to understand such basic structures, such as a moat. These quaint ideas strike me as somewhat flawed, as a ditch is significantly less effective than a palisade, a long line of sharpened wooden stakes planted into the ground, which would have been considerably more straightforward, quicker to construct and more effective. As for evil spirits, would not a neat little 6-inch channel achieve the same symbolic purpose as a huge 5-meter ditch? Lieutenant Colonel William Hawley was one of the amateur archaeologists, employed by the Ministry of Works to undertake excavations at our famous monuments Stonehenge and Avebury in the 1920s. Unfortunately, he was not the most careful of archaeologists. This was a view shared by colleagues such as Atkinson. In his book, Stonehenge 3rd edition, London 1979, where he suggests that Hawley's methods were somewhat inadequate. Despite this accusation of carelessness, he was still able to find some strange features, which can clearly be seen as evidence of a moat. For example, below a layer of chalk rubble infill, chalk which would have fallen naturally into the moat when it was disused, under a layer of flint, he discovered foot-trampled mud, found in an area of chalkland which has no natural mud or clay, with an associated layer of struck flint which he found in many segments. Now this, in itself, sounds quite interesting, if not conclusive as evidence of the existence of a moat, until you look for other landscape features with similar foundations which, when analyzed, start to build up a much more conclusive picture. Such landscape features can be found in dew ponds. A dew pond is an artificial pond usually sited on the top of a hill, intended for watering livestock. Dew ponds are used in areas where a natural supply of surface water may not be readily available. The name dew pond, sometimes cloud pond or mist pond, is first found in the Journal of the Royal Agricultural Society in 1865. Despite the name, their primary source of water is believed to be rainfall rather than dew or mist. They are usually shallow, saucer-shaped and lined with puddled clay, chalk or marl on an insulating straw layer over a bottom layer of chalk or lime. To deter earthworms from their natural tendency of burrowing upwards, which would in a short while make the clay lining porous, a layer of soot would be incorporated or lime mixed with the clay. The clay is usually covered with straw to prevent cracking by the sun and a final layer of chalk rubble or broken stone to protect the lining from the hoofs of sheep or cattle. So, was it a dew pond liner that Hawley found at the bottom of the ditches at Stonehenge? I believe so. Nonetheless, Hawley can be forgiven for not recognizing that this clay lining feature being used to stop the lying water being absorbed through the porous chalk into the bedrock. Because he was not looking for a moat, as he was incorrectly informed by his geologists, that the surrounding area was perceived to have been dry for over 500,000 years and therefore did not have a raised water table in the past. Hawley also found evidence of what he called a strange dark soil layer which existed within the primary fill. In many parts of the ditch I would strongly suggest that this dark soil layer consisted of decayed remains and sediment, possible the hay which is traditionally lined with the clay to stop cracking. Moreover, over time, organic matter would have naturally floated to the bottom, like a pond, especially if they had not been cleaned regularly. This would naturally have left a lining of dark soil at the bottom of the moat as it fell into disuse and became dry. By 1923 Hawley reported that this ubiquitous dark layer was found throughout his excavations, sometimes up to 8 inches thick, suggesting its existence in water would have been for some considerable length of time, and it was resting directly at the bottom of the moated ditch. This dark layer was also observed by Atkinson in 1954 when they recut a piece of Hawley's trench, segment 98, and found the same dark layer, not flint this time, but a stone layer. Moreover, he described the soils above as loamy, sand and clay, and that this layer, like the construction of dew ponds, was often associated with a layer of struck flint, which was found in many segments to protect the clay lining. There it has now been established that Stonehenge had, at some stage, a layer of waterproofing, the layer of foot-trampled mud plus a layer of struck flint added to the ditch. It's also been established that this ditch was, at some point, filled with water for quite some considerable amount of time, as evidenced by the deep dark layer sediment. This use of the ditch as a moat is escalated in Hawley's finding of other moats that surrounded the north and south mounds, which connected to the Stonehenge moated ditch. On the shallow associated banks of the ditches, he finds lots of what he calls yellow marl. Quote, "There was a quantity of the yellowish marl within the ditch and about the site of the palisade." End quote. Marl was originally an old term loosely applied to a variety of materials, most of which occur as loose, earthy deposits, formed under freshwater conditions, specifically an earthy substance containing 35 to 65% clay and 65 to 35% carbonate. As this marl had fragments of blue and sarsen stones within it, this clearly shows that fresh water was in the moat and present at the time of construction. If you look at remains of the Stonehenge moat today, it appears very shallow and uneven, but when excavated, it looks very different. It is, in fact, a series of individual pits, which, in places, are connected by shallow walls. This opens up a series of fascinating unanswered questions. Was the ditch half finished, for the pits differ in size, shape and depth, or perhaps they were dodgy Welsh builders who did not know what they were doing? If the ditch is indeed defensive or symbolic as some archaeologists suggest, why not pile the chalk on one side rather than both sides? Why are there seats or shelves left in the ditch? Why are there stone holes at the bottom of a moated ditch? The only reason you would cut the ditch down to different levels is to search for the groundwater level under the chalk bedrock. As chalk is a porous substance and water travels freely through it, the groundwater table over an area like Stonehenge can vary by a meter or so depending on the makeup of the chalk, as water runs through the fault lines in the chalk strata, leading to varying groundwater levels over an area. The prehistoric health spa. Timothy Darvill, professor of archaeology at Bournemouth University, has revealed research that he believes shows that Stonehenge was an ancient healing place. In his book, Stonehenge, the biography of a landscape, the professor cites that human remains excavated from burial mounds near Stonehenge reveal that many of the buried had been ill before their death. Darvill also suggests that these remains are not those of local people but of people who had travelled from far and wide. For example, the Amesbury Archer, the name given to one of the remains identified, originated from what is now known as Switzerland. The professor believes that Stonehenge would have been predominantly used during the winter solstice when our ancestors believed it was occupied by Apollo, the Greek and Roman god of healing. However, I would suggest that it was not the gods alone at Stonehenge that encouraged people from across the known world to travel such vast distances. It was another feature of Stonehenge that still survives today, the legendary bluestone. Bluestones are unexceptional, igneous rocks, such as dolerite and rhyolite. They are so called because they take on a bluish hue when wet. Over the centuries, legends have endowed these stones with mystical properties. The British poet Lorman, inspired by the folklore accounts of 12th century cleric Geoffrey of Monmouth, wrote in 1215. The stones are great, and magic power they have. Men that are sick fare to that stone, and they wash that stone, and with that water bathe away their sickness. As this ancient poem very obviously shows, the sick would bathe away their illnesses. I find it surprising that Professor Darvill never linked this revealing poem to his hypothesis. Recently, findings by Professor Mike Parker Pearson of Sheffield University have revealed a smaller version of Stonehenge, confirming the link between bluestones and water. Another interesting aspect of the moat at Stonehenge discovered by Hawley was the number of craters found at the bottom of the moat. These craters were large enough to have accommodated quite large bluestones. In fact, Hawley in one particular part of the moat found a 2-meter wide hole which he described as a post hole. This, however, is too big for a post, but it could easily have been a stone hole as its size and shape was similar to the remaining standing bluestones we see today in front of the sarsen stone circle. It should be remembered that bluestones aren't the same size as the sarsen stones, they're much smaller. In fact, an average visitor to the Stonehenge monument may quite easily scan over them without really noticing their presence. Archaeologists currently believe that their small size is because they are what remains after the damage by souvenir hunters over the years. But I propose that they may well have been small when brought to Stonehenge originally, for they have little to no building quality, but as a healing agent to be placed at the edge and in the moat, to initiate their healing qualities. As an indication of how these stones were initially used, archaeologists have identified a colossal amount of bluestone chippings covering the entire site at Stonehenge, 3,600 in fact, so many they call the soil surrounding which contain these shards the Stonehenge layer. I would suggest that just as we enjoy adding a variety of salts to our baths today, so did the Mesolithic people. They would have added a small amount of bluestone chippings into the moat as they bathed. By chipping the bluestones, revealing the inner core, their healing qualities would have been enhanced. The traditional view of why these quantities of bluestone chippings are abundant is because they were worked upon and then reshaped to fit the holes, which had been already prepared. This seems completely illogical. Why would anyone in their right mind undertake the grueling task of working on this exceptionally hard stone to fit into the holes, when it would have been so much easier to have dug the chalk soil first to accommodate the shape of the stones? Another traditional view is that the many chippings found were remnants from dressing by reshaping of these bluestones. Given that archaeologists believe that the bluestone chips exist only because of the reworking by our ancestors or the result of Victorian souvenir hunters, it would be interesting to compare their number, 3,675, to the number of chippings discovered from the softer, easier to break, more famous and more plentiful sarsen stones, which we know were reworked. You would think, proportionately, 251 cubic meters of sarsen stones v 28 metric meters of bluestones, there would be a lot more sarsen stone chipping to bluestones, but you would be wrong. Only 2,173 sarsen stone pieces have been found despite there being over 9 times more sarsen stones than bluestones. So, assuming that there would have been a similar level of interest in blue and sarsen stones by souvenir hunters, and a similar amount of reworking of the stones by our ancestors, you would expect to find at least 30,000 sarsen stone fragments, but has already shown a paltry 2,173 has been discovered. Or if 2,173 sarsen stones pieces were the norm for both reworking and souvenir hunters, they should have found only 240 bluestone fragments and not the 3,675. I can therefore very confidently conclude that the bluestones were deliberately broken up to be used in the moat. Our ancestors are likely to have believed that once the outside covering of the bluestones had been thoroughly exhausted, the beneficial properties would be diminished, and so they were abandoned. This is confirmed by Tim Darvill and Geoffrey Wainwright, who stated our excavations within Stonehenge in 2008 confirmed what earlier excavations had hinted at, namely that the bluestones started to be broken up and chipped away more or less from the time they were set up in each successive arrangement. The concept of a prehistoric man bathing away his ills may seem absurd to some, but throughout history, it has been shown that humanity has been attracted to this type of treatment. It became commonplace in Britain during the Roman Empire some 2,000 years ago, when every large villa had its own spa. Let's recap what we have learnt. 6. Hawley found evidence of a water sealant at the bottom of the Stonehenge ditch, which he described as foot-trampled mud in association with a flint layer, proving that water was planned to be in the ditch. 7. Hawley found evidence of a dark layer in most of his excavations, proving the presence of a moat with water-decayed organic matter and sediment. 8. The Stonehenge ditch is built of individual pits with seats and internal walls. The only reason you would build such a structure is if it was a moat for water. 9. The extensive number of bluestone fragments in proportion to the sarsen stone chippings proves that the bluestones were deliberately broken up to be used for bathing within the moat.